Okay, so in this video, we're going to go over just a couple of really easy ways to use some of the Arnold shaders to our advantage. And as you can see, I have this real simple setup just so that we can sort of see what happens. And just keep in mind, it's always a good idea to start with something really simple and manageable when you're trying something out for the first time. This way, you're not editing anything that you plan on using. This is just to get all of your ducks in a row, so to speak. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just come over to my Hypershade, and we're going to start with one of the easiest shaders to use, which is the AI Wireframe. So when I click on it, you see that we come up with our shader node, and right now the only thing that we really have to focus on are some of the options that we have. And in most cases, we probably don't want to show the triangles of our geometry. It really doesn't benefit us when we're trying to show the wireframe for a demo piece or anything. So what I can do is just grab our shader, and I'll just grab all of my objects. It's very simple. I can right-click on the icon, just drag up to where it says Assign the Material to the Viewport selection. And when I let go, we now have all of my objects with that shader. Now when I come over to my Arnold render view, this is going to give me my interactive preview, my IPR. And before I hit the go button over here, I'm just going to come over to my render options, and I'm going to go to Save UI Threads. And this is really beneficial because what it's going to do is it's going to let some of the processors on my computer be just for me, and only some of the other ones will be used to send over to the render calculation. And the reason that you want to do this is it's not very interactive if everything that you're doing is slowed down because it's working overtime trying to give you this preview. So when I hit the play button, you can see that as I move this around, we have the interaction playing. And as I get closer, you can see how the wireframe is behaving. Now, it's always a good idea to really take into account the full resolution that you're planning on using. Right now, I'm rendering with the default setting, which is 960 by 540. Definitely not what you're going to end up rendering with, so I might go ahead and close this out, open up my render settings, and then over here, we'll just switch this over to my full 1080 HD. And that's going to be the 1920 by 1080 video, which is really, I mean, it's standard, but honestly, I don't see it even being standard for very long with 4K televisions and Ultra HD Blu-rays. 4K is really becoming the standard. However, for television, 1080 is working just fine, and you can still see that plenty of people are using Blu-ray movies. So I'm going to come over to my Arnold render view again, pop this open, play again, and you can see now that it's rendering the full resolution. I have a better idea of just how thick these border lines in the wireframe really are in proportion to my object. So one of the first things that we can do with this shader is we can change the thickness of our line. So our line width right now is set to a solid 1. If I change this to maybe 1.7, you can see that the lines become a bit bolder. Now you have to be really careful with this because if you increase this too much, the lines will get so thick that some of these objects are just starting to look indistinguishable. You're just not going to be able to see the amount of detail that's on your object. But I'm going to leave those decisions up to you because this is your object. One thing that you can always do, you can change the background color. You can make it anything you want. You can even make the lines white. So, have fun with it. Choose something that you find unique or something that really fits for your scene. And really, that's pretty much it. The only other thing that I want to recommend, have you watch out for, is right now we're looking at excuse me, you're looking at each individual polygon. This object is clearly not smoothed, and you can see that it's not smoothed because you can see every polygon. If I switch this over and do a smooth preview by hitting the 3 key, this is going to smooth my object, and it's also going to increase the number of polygons visible inside of my mesh in the 3D render view. This is because the wireframe takes into account not just the polygons that you see, but the polygons that are actually rendered. So be very careful about that. It may be a situation where in order for your objects to really look their best in wireframe, you actually have to create a separate pass specifically so that you can lower the quality or the smooth preview back to 1 so that you can see your objects for what they really are. And remember, it's okay if it looks a little bit jagged or boxy, because that's kind of the point. That's the point you're trying to get. It's the, hey, look at how clean my geometry is. Look at how I understand how edge flows are, all that good stuff. Okay, now the next thing that we're going to look at is using the occlusion shader. And I'd like to first demonstrate it just like I did with the wireframe shader, and that will be just by creating the ambient occlusion shader itself. And so we will clear my graph and then just drag in our one shader, select everything, and then once again just do assign to all. Now I'm going to open up the Arnold render preview. Go ahead and hit play. And as you can see, the render preview is giving us something that, if you're not familiar with this, looks very different from what you'd expect. If this was any other kind of shader in the scene and we didn't have any lights, and I can show you that if I open up my light editor, there are no lights in my scene. And yet here we are, we're seeing all of this illumination. This is entirely a trick. And the reason that this is calculating so quickly is because all of the calculations being done here are simply being done based on the distance from one object to another. Okay, so as I move this, watch closely, you can see that the darkness that you're seeing here is being calculated simply by the distance between these two objects from each other. Okay, so basically what you're doing is you're calculating proximity. And right now, the proximity is set inside of the occlusion node, and it is saying that regardless, no matter how far away nothing is, it's going to continue looking out even if it doesn't see anything. And this is why one of the nicest settings that we have here is this fall off setting. Now, right now, the fall off setting is set to 0. That does not mean that there is no fall off. What it actually means is fall off is almost being calculated into infinity. So watch what happens if I change this to a large fall off number. Okay, now, as you can see, the fall off is the darker areas. If I make this number much smaller, the darkness is going to be calculated further out. That's what's falling off, not the brightness. And the reason that this is happening is because, once again, like I said, this is a total fake. And it is very, very beneficial because what it can do is it can calculate the illusion of bounced light. Now, I'm going to pause for a second because it's important to note that Arnold has the ability to render and calculate bounced light. Inside of our render tab, the diffuse option is whether or not you're calculating those bounces of light. And remember, something very, very important here. I'm going to just drop this open. Notice that we have sampling and ray tracing. These are the first two options. Something very important to keep in mind. Sampling is literally how many times a pixel is going to be calculated. And the more it's calculated, in theory, the better the quality, the less noise, the more accurate, etc. Okay? So, with a setting of 2, that's pretty low. And in most cases, if you were going to calculate diffuse, this number would probably have to go much higher. Now, that is whether or not it's calculating a lot to get the quality that you want. Now down here underneath ray trace, this is the important one. This is the one that says, am I calculating this at all? I'm going to go ahead and turn off the diffuse option. And I'm also going to turn off the diffuse calculation for the quality setting. With both of these settings turned off, I'm going to go ahead and play it again, and notice nothing has changed. This is one of the greatest things about the ambient occlusion trick, because the ambient occlusion trick is just that. It is not calculating the bouncing of light. It is actually just a trick that calculates the proximity of one object to the other. And as I get closer and closer to this object, or I change the size or the scale of it, the proximity starts to affect the objects around it that also have that same shader. All right. Now, something else that's really important to note, because again, this is a total trick. If I were to create, and I'm just going to use a directional light because directional lights don't require any kind of major adjustments as far as light decay or intensity or anything else. Notice that no matter what I do with this light, nothing is updating inside of that render. And the reason that nothing is changing is because this shader could care less what light is doing. These shaders have nothing to do with light, and yet here we are. We're looking at this, and our brain says this is what light does. This is actually occlusion. And occlusion is basically what happens when light is bouncing through a room and then it gets to a point where objects are obstructing it. When objects are trying to have light bounce back and forth and light's going through the room, when it reaches a point where two objects are close together, those bounced rays just can't get in there as much as other rays. And that's why, and if you look in the room that you're sitting in, if there is any kind of light going on, any kind of occluded light, you're going to see that happen. There is darkness in the corners of your room. There's darkness around any object or, shelving. There's darkness up along the edges of the wall. This is one of the nicest, easiest tricks because it also is rendering incredibly fast. Now, the occlusion node can be rendered just like this. You can render it simply to show the physical shape of the objects that you've modeled. Now, this is certainly one way, and many, many people use it for this, and that's a good thing. But what you can actually do with it, this is where we take it one step further. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an AI standard shader. Now, an AI standard shader is great because it has all of the settings that we need to make it just about any other kind of shader. So we can make it something really shiny and reflective. We can make it something really rough and dull. Sky's the limit with this one. We have everything that we need. So what I've done is I've already switched it over. So all of these objects now have this shader, the AI surface shader. And as soon as I do that, and remember, I'm still rendering right now, what happened? All of a sudden, I don't see any of my objects anymore. And the reason is, there's no light in my scene. If I wanted to see my objects, I would first have to create a light, and there you can see it's appearing. And I'm going to zoom it up a little bit, and I'll angle it at a different direction. And now all of a sudden I can see my objects. There are all my objects, and they're very, very shiny. And as we can see, because I've turned off the occlusion, I've turned off the diffuse calculation. These shadows are as dark as can be. Now, if I were to go back over to my render settings and I turn on my diffuse bounces, and I'll just set that to 1, and I'll turn on my diffuse quality to 3, you can see that instantly we're starting to calculate those bounces of light reaching into those darker areas. And the brighter light that I have, the brighter these areas would be. Now, there's something really important going on right now. This is calculating as close to reality as possible. And while that's a good thing, the render time is going to be anywhere between 4 to 10 times the length of time if I didn't have the diffuse on at all. So if I turn both of those off and we go back to this really, really dark version of my scene, I'm going to use the best of both worlds. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my shader. My Ambient Occlusion shader is going to be attached into my AI surface shader. Now, this is actually a technique that industry has been using for years, mainly because it was the only way to get the quality and the render time that they needed. Even Pixar did this technique. And only recently, I think as recently as Monsters University, was really the first time that they ever didn't use this technique, because they had, tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of computer processors that could churn out all of their animation. Well, very few places on the planet have that much computing power just to make images. And what we want to do is we want to present the best version of our work that we possibly can with the best render speed that we possibly can. Because what good is having beautiful pictures if you can't get them rendered on time? That is why I'm teaching you this trick. Now, inside of the AI surface shader, down here there is a setting called Emission. All right. Now, right now, it is not on at all. And that's why we see it the way we do. Now, if I start to increase the weight of this setting, look what starts to happen. Now, anybody who's familiar with any kind of Maya shaders might look at this and go, wow, that looks a lot like the incandescence or the ambience on a Maya shader. And that's very much what's going on here. It creates the illusion that the object itself has some kind of a light property. Now, why are we going to use this? Well, because if we think about what the Ambient Occlusion shader does for us, it's going to create this added light source. And rather than making it look like the light source is coming from the object itself, it's going to trick our brain into thinking that what we see is, in fact, very believable because it's what we see in the real world. Now, it's very simple to make this happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this over. And I'm going to, real quick, turn off that I'm going to disable the docking so that that doesn't happen again. I accidentally dragged it into a window, and it wanted to dock with something. Thanks, Maya. All right, so what we're going to do is this. Very, very simple. I have my shader, and I have my ambient occlusion. Right now, the AI standard surface shader is selected. And all I want to do is take this ambient occlusion and simply drag it into the color of my emission. And when I do that, nothing is going to happen because my weight is not turned on yet. But watch what happens as I start to increase that weight. Now, what we're creating is the best of both worlds, because the Ambient Occlusion shader ignored light, which means that this shadow couldn't exist. And the AI surface shader couldn't have done this with all of these added little gradients and details and secondary shadows and occluded light without the ambient occlusion. Now, you can still dial in some of these settings, but with fall off set to 0.1, you might need to go a little lower, you might need to go a little higher. That's going to be entirely up to you. But one thing that I often do is I change the white setting to a very, very low gray, because I don't want to wash out all of my objects. What I do want to do is have just enough of that artificial light bounce inside of the shadow to trick your eye. And keep in mind, this is something that I cannot tell you exactly what setting you need. These are things that you're going to have to figure out based on your light situation, based on your textures, based on your scene. Okay, the needs of your scene trump any of these different kinds of settings. All right. Now, once we've got it like that, and we've got those lower settings, I can start to dial in exactly how much I want simply by increasing or decreasing here. Now, right now, I'm only using one shader as an example. So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, what happens when I start using all different kinds of shaders for all different kinds of pieces of my geometry? It's very, very simple. Every single time you make a new AI standard surface, and I'm just going to make this one magenta so that I can apply it to this one. Okay, so now you can see there's definitely a new piece of geometry in there. I'm going to take that exact same ambient shader and I'm going to drop it into the new surface shaders emission. I'm going to apply it to every single shader. And the greatest part about this is I can do it and dial in all of my settings individually for the object, all the while keeping this one master setting for every object in my scene. So for example, if I wanted my entire scene to just have a little bit of warmth in it, as if it's almost sunset, and so all of the light that's bouncing through my world is turning a little bit orange, maybe I'd come over here and change my white color to a little warm. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at all of my objects picking up that kind of added color. Maybe I want to create a cool feeling. So I'll use a little bit of desaturated bluish gray. Maybe I want it to be a little sickly. I want it to be a little scary or moody. Maybe I'll turn it green or even red. All of this is taking place in my ambient occlusion shader. And if we think about it, my one little ambient occlusion shader, if I look at my down channel, that's the input and output button right here, it'll show me every shader that it's connected to. And so far, I only have 2. Eventually, this one little shader node is going to have every single one of your other objects. That way you have a master node that you can adjust. So for example, let's say that by the time you're all done, you realize pretty late in the game that you really wish there was a little bit more detail inside of these shadows. You're just not a huge fan of the quality of the shadow that you're getting. Well, right now the samples are set to 1, which is pretty good. But let's just say you wanted it to be 4. I just changed the samples on the occlusion for every single object because it's only one of those little shaders feeding into all of the other shaders for me. And because we're only using it a little bit, instead of just using it 100% so it ignored light, now any additional lights that I add into my scene, so for example, I'll just grab a point light. And remember, because Arnold really believes that, that lights are real, this light is going to be very, very hard to see until I start to increase the intensity. So I'm going to come over to my intensity setting, and I'll just increase this, and we'll see how it starts to, there you go. So now you can see it's starting to affect the scene. And I can even make this a different color. Let's make it bright yellow, so you can see, there it is. You can see the light definitely hitting on this, this magenta object. But now the light is interacting the way we would expect it to be. All the while, the ambient occlusion is still doing its part. So this is what I mean when I say it's the best of both worlds. Okay? So keep in mind that you don't have to have this all set up at the very beginning. However, it will definitely help you out to have that ambient occlusion shader, so that each time you make a new surface shader, one of the first things you'll want to do is just make sure you drag it over into the emission, and at the very least, just turn it on a little bit, because as you start adding textures and as you start dialing the settings that you want for this particular object, that's going to be very, very useful, because you'll be able to see how it blends and works together with all of the other objects in your scene. All right, so hope you enjoyed this, and good luck.